The chase now continued in earnest. Young Perkins raced ahead, dodging in and around trees. All the while, the glowing dead illuminating the shrouded fog. The hair-raising screams hideously merged with shrieks of horror and cries of anguish echoing the night, reverberating against the moss-covered trees and the bubbling, oozing swamp. It was no use. The chase was over. Young Perkins' legs felt like rubber. For a brief moment, he thought of escaping the blind horrors by, perhaps, climbing a tree. However, his attempts at seeking refuge among the branches were found to be impossible. In fact, the trees of the haunted swamp had been terribly beslimed. The slippery coatings of moss prevented every effort. Gathering what little strength remaining, young Perkins stumbled a few yards ahead, only to collapse in breathless exhaustion, awaiting the coup de grace by the icy grip of death. Cadaverous hands would drag him down into the mire, down into the pit. It was obvious that the end was near. His eyes began to tear as he reflects on his family. His grandmother, Miss Emma, would be heartbroken. She would forever wonder what had become of her young man. And what would Miss Hazel think? Would there be a search party? No. He knew that to die in the haunted swamp was to be damned. No one could brave the dangers. No one would even think of looking for two young colored boys, leastwise not in the swamp of the dead, not even in daylight. Young Perkins in those final moments cursed himself, hating his mad plan of pursuing the mysterious Mr. Pickman, and of taking the conjure woman's cane. His collapse made a noise, a loud splash, in which acted in alerting the blind spirits to his whereabouts. Young Perkins, who bleary-eyed gazes in apathy at the approach of death, for now the glowing specters were closing in. Young Perkins gazed in numb fascination as the spectral figures became more distinct. The hollowness of the eyes, of sightless eyes, of the worm-ridden skulls of the rotted things. The way they looked, their appearance, white bones, tinges of flesh, that putrid skeletal frame. Dear God, the way that unearthly glow eerily illuminated the surroundings. The groping, grunting, sightless monsters were a thing of horror. A horror not seen this side of hell's searing flames. At least, it would all be over. One of the sightless dead were merely feet away. Splashing his hand, young Perkins calls out for the formless souls to finish it. Whereupon, one by one, the glowing specters begin groping their way toward him. Young Perkins closes his eyes and gives his soul to God. Waiting was maddening. He could hear their grunting. He could smell the stench of decay, the noxious odor of fetid air. Again, his hand began splashing. This only acted in agitating the sightless creatures which emitted such ear-piercing shrieks. The ungodly sounds chilling the blood. What was it? They were near enough to reach out and touch him, snatch him, like a viper snatches its prey. Horrid hands threatened to hold him in the grip of doom. Hideous fingers constricting, dragging his soul down into that eternal darkness. The sound of his splashing echoed from afar. Here I am! Young Perkins commands his death, boldly defying death to embrace him. Still, the horrid creatures rage in their blindness, screaming, howling, shrieking out in tormented anguish. but none gripping him. Their hands were stayed by something. What? Lo, looking about him, young Perkins realized to his utter amazement that he had, in his flight, reached the swamp's center, its heart. For towering just above him was a rectangular-shaped, moss-covered granite boulder that stood approximately 12 feet high. It had been split down the center by some ancient work of magic long ago, long before the Indians. Its fracturing actually occurred during the mystical age of Atlantis. At the center of its base flows a fragrant stream of healing waters, waters of salvation. Tasting the waters, young Perkins found the water as sweet as it were fragrant. The spring had been blessed long ago, long before the antediluvian age. They were blessed by a priest from a religious sect that had long vanished from the earth, a time in which both poles were green. So thus being blessed, it acted in repelling the orbless minions. The waters in which he lay, which flowed from the sheltering stone. Young Perkins began weeping uncontrollably. Lying back, he made watery mud angels, his arms and legs spreading, then coming together. From his heart down to the gut of his soul, young Perkins gives sincere praises to a merciful God. One by one, the hunting specters departed to once more lurk beneath the bubbling mire of the sulfur pits. Young Perkins breathed a sigh of relief as he watched the fluorescent figures fading within the receding fog. The mist was, indeed, slowly dying away. But what of Kevin? What would he tell his mother? The young man's tears of joy slowly turn to sorrow as he reflects upon the demise of his foolish companion. Kevin! Young Perkins calls out. Nothing. Not a sound, save for the last dying shrieks of the blind dead who release a final, desperate wailing howl as their souls slowly submerge, disappearing within the tormenting pits. Soaking wet, the young man kneels and prays for the loss of his friend. All the while his mind is tortured by scenes of Kevin being horribly mutilated. Nightmarish visions of Kevin being dragged, screaming, down into the pit, his soul never finding peace. The young man briefly thought to exchange his soul for that of his companion Kevin, to perhaps one day go back to the haunted swamp. There, he would seek out the pit where Kevin lay imprisoned beneath the mire. He would exchange his soul for that of Kevin's. Kevin would be free, while he would languish in soulless agony there deep beneath the bubbling mire. With the dispersal of the fog came the moon's illumination, allowing the young man's surroundings to become more defined. Upon examining the stone, young Perkins found a strange inscription carved deep within its cleft. Whatever secret the mysterious inscription held would forever be lost to history. Its cryptic hieroglyphs were, indeed, strangely intriguing, yet completely indecipherable. Circling its space, the young man came to appreciate the boulder's impressive size. Roughly estimating, he found the stone to be approximately 30, perhaps 40 feet in diameter. It was a smooth, save for the clinging moss and creeping vines, gave it the appearance of a great, half-moss-covered tower. The fracture in its center reminded one of a partially open beak of some gigantic bird. There was no fighting it. Young Perkins, from that moment until the end of his days, would be forever haunted by the memory of him releasing his friend, deserting Kevin in the time of his greatest need. Kevin, the best friend a guy could ask for. Kevin, mercilessly tormented by his sister Trina. Kevin, always smiling, always game for a lark. Some new quest, some new adventure. There would be nothing. Nothing to mark his final resting place. No headstone would mark his grave. Gathering his composure, young Perkins strikes out in the direction of the conjure woman's shack. Though the fog had not completely dissipated, the young man managed through dead reckoning to make his way out of the haunted swamp. So, after overcoming the many trials and ordeals, still the young man's inner self condemned him for Kevin's sake. Beneath the cover of the shadows, young Perkins stands staring at the conjure woman's shack, which looms ominously in the near distance. Young Perkins was on the verge of doing that which none had ever done before. Never in the mind of any Negro would they ever attempt, never dare to imagine even visiting the conjure woman's shack. Young Perkins reflects with a mournful pride of how he and Jonah had been the very first to defy Muskie sundown law. Even then, he was forced to abandon his only witness, leaving his cousin to suffer in the torments of the mob. Of the tree, young Perkins finds himself alone again. Without a witness. Oh, how he wished his pal Kevin was by his side. Skulking like a cat, young Perkins strategically maneuvered. Crawling on his belly, his dark silhouette gave the appearance of a feline stalking its prey. 50 feet from cover, out of the protective shadows of the swamp, he finds himself beneath the large shuttered window of the conjure woman's shack. Crouching with his back pressed tightly against the wall, he listens chillingly as the sound of mysterious chanting echoes against the ragged shutters. Beneath the window, young Perkins crouches beside an old, worm-ridden water barrel. The days of its function had long since rotted away. It was no longer meant to carry water. It now carried a more elevated status. It was a thing of reverence. It had been placed there to receive offerings and tokens of favor. Favor from those foolhardy enough to brave the perils of the swamp. Only the desperate, only those in dire need, dared take the conjure woman's trail. To walk that path was madness. Yet there he was, there in the darkness, there beneath the window of the conjure woman's lair. Perkins' beating heart sent surges of blood coursing through his veins, the pounding in his ears deafening. Curious, young Perkins reaches over and begins to feel the inside of the barrel. One by one, the youth withdraws various tokens, odd, unusual gifts such as a gourd with black and white string wound tightly around its center. That particular gift had a $10 bill pinned to the binding twine. That was the first $10 bill Perkins had ever seen,